Welcome to History Things with Pat. Today we're going to be talking about the Maryland Campaign of 1862 and Confederate General Robert E. Lee's first invasion of the North. (1862) would start out very well for the Union Army. General George B. McClellan will have invaded Virginia during the Peninsula Campaign and on June 1st stood only a couple miles outside the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. Fortunes would change quickly, however, for the Confederacy when Commander Joseph E. Johnston is severely wounded at the Battle of Seven Pines. Confederate General Robert E. Lee, commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, will assume Johnston's command. Lee, now in command of all Confederate forces, would attack McClellan aggressively during the 7 days battle from June 25th to July 1st, 1862. General McClellan, who was overly cautious by nature and completely overwhelmed by this newfound aggressiveness, would order a retreat of the Army of the Potomac down the Virginia Peninsula. With the Union Army of the Potomac now retreating down the Virginia Peninsula, Robert E. Lee could then turn his attention towards Union Major General John Pope and his Army of Virginia. Over the next 30 days, during what's known as the Northern Virginia Campaign, Confederate General Robert E. Lee would outmaneuver and ultimately defeat Union Major General John Pope, most significantly at the Battle of Second Manassas, or Second Battle of Bull Run in August of 1862, forcing the Union Army to retreat to the defenses of Washington, D.C. Fresh off his 9-day turnaround in the Virginia Peninsula, Robert E. Lee's momentum will carry him north, across the Potomac River, and into Maryland. Many factors will go into Lee's decision to invade Maryland, mainly of which will be his major need to resupply, not only on food and clothes and ammunition, but also on men, as his success in the Virginia Peninsula had come at the great cost of manpower and resources. Maryland was largely a Southern sympathetic state, and Robert E. Lee rationalized that the state would be full of willing volunteers ready to shake the bonds of the federal tyrants in D.C., and the fields would be fresh with food. The second of Robert E. Lee's decisions to invade the North being that the North had yet to feel the wrath of this ugly war on its own sovereign soils, the entirety of the war at this point having been fought in the Southern theater on the fields of Virginia. Lee figured that Northern citizens' support of the war effort would diminish greatly when they were forced to deal with the reality of wars on their fields and their economies. On September 2nd, 1862, President Abraham Lincoln restores General George B. McClellan as commander of all Union forces. McClellan is known as a skilled organizer and trainer of troops, and Lincoln has entrusted him to combine what remained of John Pope's Army of Virginia with McClellan's Army of the Potomac, garrisoned in Washington, D.C. 2 days later, on September 4th, 1862, the first elements of Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia will cross the Potomac River into Maryland near Point of Rocks from Loudoun County, Virginia. The main body of the Army, 55,000 men strong, recently reinforced by divisions under D.H. Hill and Lafayette McLaws, will be encamped in Frederick by September 2nd. Now Lincoln, understanding that Confederate soldiers have crossed into Maryland, sends the Army of the Potomac in a fanning motion out into the state of Maryland, probing, trying to find where Lee is. On September 9th, 1862, with the Army of Northern Virginia still camped in Frederick, Confederate General Robert E. Lee will issue Special Orders No. 191. Special Orders No. 191 will detail the movements of the Confederate Army as they cross the Potomac River into Maryland, and as Lee intended to divide the Army into 4 parts. Lee would send Major General James Longstreet to Hagerstown and Boonesboro to investigate rumors that militia had begun forming against Confederate war efforts. Lee would send Stonewall Jackson to the garrison and arsenal at Harper's Ferry to secure the potential rear escape and the 14,000 Union soldiers stationed there. and that would leave Jeb Stuart and D.H. Hill to act as the rear guard for the remaining main body of the Confederate force as they crossed over South Mountain. Two days after Robert E. Lee issues Special Orders Number 191, the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia will begin to move out of Frederick. And on September 13th, members of the 27th Indiana Volunteers will be the first Union soldiers to enter the same area where the Confederate Army had been encamped only days before. Corporal Barton W. Mitchell will find an envelope and 3 cigars wrapped in a paper bundle, and upon realizing the significance of the envelope, will have the envelope passed all the way up the chain of command to General George B. McClellan. The contents of the envelope are going to be a copy of Special Orders Number 191 that had been intended for D.H. Hill, that had been accidentally left behind. The manner in which these were left behind is still a matter of debate, as D.H. Hill swore until the day he died that he had never received the orders and that his copy of Number 191 had been transcribed and delivered personally by Stonewall Jackson himself. Nonetheless, understanding the significance of the orders in his hand, General George B. McClellan proclaims, "I have here a paper with which, if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home." The Union Army now had the Confederate battle plan in their hands. They knew where Lee was and where Lee's strengths were. The chase was on as McClellan pursued the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia into South Mountain.